Welcome to the second webinar in the Back to Basics series on awards and national employment standards. My name is Michelle and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Kylie James. Kylie is a Human Resources and Industrial Relations Specialist and IR and I put this word specialist in the wrong spot. Hang on. And IR specialist. There we go. Okay. Third time. Let's go. Welcome to the second webinar in the Back to Basics series on awards and national employment standards. My name is Michelle and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Kylie James. Kylie is a Human Resources and Industrial Relations Specialist and advisor to NatRoad Members. Today, Kylie will give you an overview of the national employment standards. Over to you, Kylie.
Thanks, Michelle, and hello to our listeners. Today, as Michelle said, we're going to go through the national employment standards. Firstly, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the material that I've used to pull this webinar together comes from a couple of different sources. Firstly, the Members Resources section on our website. There's a range of fact sheets that are available for you to be able to read at any time of the day, basically. Secondly, the Fair Work Ombudsman website. There's a range of information on the Fair Work Ombudsman website that does talk to you about the industrial relations system. And finally, the questions that we receive from our members. Every day, our members call us and ask us questions. So what we're trying to do here is pull together a series that enables us to answer those questions so we can share this information more broadly with you. So as I mentioned, this webinar will go through the national employment standards. To keep it, a little bit more shorter, national employment standards can be quite a lengthy word to say. So it's often referred to as the NES, N-E-S. So throughout this presentation, I'll refer to this as the NES. This presentation will just go through in general. However, our future presentations in the series will talk about each of the different elements in more detail. So as I mentioned, we'll be covering off the 11 elements of the NES, and then we'll talk about them in more detail in future sessions. So what is the NES? Well, first of all, it was embedded in the Fair Work Act of 2009 since the 1st of January in 2010. So it's legislation essentially, and it outlines the minimum entitlements for employees in Australia. There are 11 minimum entitlements that employees are entitled to. Modern awards and enterprise agreements may include additional terms to the NES, but they can't exclude the NES. So they can't offer conditions that are less than what the NES actually offers employees. Casual employees are a little bit different though. They don't receive all of the NES entitlements. They only receive a portion of them. So when we talk about the more detailed elements of the NES in the future sessions, we'll talk about the differences between full-time and part-time employees and casual employees, so you can get an understanding of what applies to casual employees and what applies to full-time and part-time employees. So some of the things that the casuals can get things like paid family and domestic violence leave, unpaid carers leave, unpaid compassionate leave, as an example. They can receive, request lots of different arrangements, but it's not an entitlement all the time under the NES. So the first element of the NES is maximum weekly hours. So the NES establishes the maximum weekly hours for employees and the circumstances in which an employee may refuse a request or requirement to work additional hours if they consider it to be unreasonable. Now, there are some requirements around averaging hours of work under an award and agreement. If you did want to go down that path, please give us a call and we can explain that in a little bit more detail. But essentially, there's a maximum weekly hours. Generally, it's around 38 hours per week. Some awards may go to 40 hours per week, but that's the maximum weekly hours that an employee needs to work. The second element is requests for flexible working arrangements. So employees can request flexible working arrangements if they have worked for the same employer for at least 12 months. So what are flexible working arrangements? Well, they essentially enable employee to change, parts of their, how they do their work. So maybe the hours that they work, the patterns that they work, or the location that they work. So working from home, as is often discussed. Can people do their jobs from home, particularly if they're a clerical staff member or doing admin? They may be able to do some of their work at home. The drivers, they might look at when they do their work. So their start and finish times might be a little bit different. Now, there are some rules when requesting flexible working arrangements when an employee requests them, but there's also rules around when an employer has to respond to a flexible working arrangement. And we'll go into that in a lot more detail in the session on flexible working arrangements. So where there is a dispute, so say an employee and an employer can't agree on what a flexible working arrangement might look like, this can be escalated to the Fair Work Commission, who can look at that and decide and determine what is the best scenario in this case. So they'll resolve that if that can't be resolved at the workplace level. The third element is conversion from casual to permanent employment. The right for casual employees to become permanent employees after 12 months of regular work with the same employer is essentially a part of the national employment standards, particularly if this is they've got that regular work and they've been with you for more than 12 months. So small business employers don't have to offer to convert their casual employees to permanent employment. However, an employee may request it. So again, we will go into more detail about this particular situation when we get to the session on casual employment. The next element is parental leave and related entitlements. Parental leave is referred to or known as maternity leave or paternity leave. These are types of parental leave. There are also other leave such as partner leave and also adoption leave that fall under this category. Parental leave is unpaid leave that can be taken after an employee gives birth, an employee's spouse or de facto's partner gives birth, or an employee adopts a child under the age of 16. Up to 12 months unpaid leave and the right to ask for an additional 12 months unpaid leave is the entitlement under the National Employment Standards. This is a separate entitlement to the paid parental leave scheme, which is funded by the Australian government. So essentially under the NES, you can get unpaid leave, but under the paid parental leave scheme, some employees may be entitled to paid parental leave. Again, we'll explain this when we get to the session on parental leave. Our next element is annual leave. All employees except for casual employees get paid annual leave. Full-time and part-time employees are entitled to 4 weeks of annual leave based on their ordinary hours of work. However, if an employee is a shift worker, they actually get an additional week. So they get 5 weeks of annual leave per year. With annual leave, there is often annual leave loading as well. So when you're paying out the base rate of pay, there's often an annual leave loading that you pay on top of that when the employee is taking leave or potentially even cashing out annual leave. Annual leave is also paid out on termination. So when an employment arrangement concludes, whether that be the employee resigning or the employer terminating the employee, annual leave is paid out on termination. Our next element is personal carers leave, compassionate leave, and family and domestic violence leave. Personal carers leave is also known as sick and carers leave. The entitlement is for 10 days paid leave, and that's prorated for part-time employees. And what this leave does is that it allows employees to take time off to help them deal with personal illness, caring responsibilities, and family emergencies. Compassionate leave, which is also known as bereavement leave, employees can take compassionate leave if a member of their immediate family or household dies or contracts it or develops a life-threatening illness or injury. They have a baby in their immediate family or household that is stillborn. They have a miscarriage, or their current spouse or de facto partner has a miscarriage. Then there's family and domestic violence leave. Now, all employees are entitled to 10 days of paid leave each year. This includes casual employees as well. Whereas compassionate leave, there are some rules around what casual employees get versus what full-time and part-time employees get, and also personal carers leave as well. But with family and domestic violence leave, all employees get that. So full-time, part-time, and casual. The next element is community service leave. Again, all employees, including casuals, can take community service leave for activities such as voluntary emergency management activities or jury duty. Long service leave is our next element, and that is paid to employees or eligible employees who have been with the same employer for a long time. Long service leave doesn't actually sit under the Fair Work Act. It sits under each state and territory's legislation. So they all have long service leaves, long service leave acts, and that will outline the employee entitlements. All state and territory legislation is very different. So we can't say that this is the entitlement. We would need to go to every single piece of legislation and have a look at what those entitlements are for each employee, depending on what state and territory they are working in. We'll go through this when we get to the long service leave webinar in a couple of sessions' time. Our next element is public holidays. Public holidays is a paid day off. So this is actually where generally there's a list of public holidays that are gazetted by every state and territory. So it could be really different. So say, for example, the public holidays are different in Victoria to what they are in Queensland. So depending on what state and territory your employee is working in will depend what their public holidays are. But there are also some really common public holidays, such as Christmas and New Year's Day. Our next element is notice of termination and redundancy pay. So notice of termination is where employees may need to give notice when they end the employment relationship. There are rules around what also must be included in an employee's final pay. So depending on how long an employee has been with the employer will depend on how much notice needs to be provided. Again, we'll go through this when we talk about notice of termination in a future session. Redundancy is when a business is no longer needs an employee's role to be done by anyone. This is not about the employee, this is about the job that's being done. So it's about a job being redundant, not an employee being, no longer required. So if an employer makes an employee's job redundant, they may need to pay the employee severance or redundancy pay. Again, based on how long the employee has been working for the employer will depend on how much redundancy pay may be required. Also, there are some rules around whether redundancy pay is needed to be paid because there are certain situations that redundancy pay does not apply. And the final element of the NES is the Fair Work Information Statement and Casual Employment Information Statement. These statements are both available on the fairwork.gov.au website, and they're statements that must be provided to all employees, particularly the Fair Work Information Statement. So when you're onboarding an employee, you should be providing them with this statement. For casual employees, they get an extra statement. They get the casual employment information statement as well. And this provides them with general information about the industrial relations system, the awards, how they're being paid, and a few other pieces of information that are relevant to their employment. So in summary, the National Employment Standards provide the minimum entitlements for employees in the National Workplace Relations System. Awards and registered agreements may provide additional entitlements, however, they cannot be less than the National Employment Standards. There are going to be other webinars in the Back to Basics series on each element of the National Employment Standards. So if you do want to know about any more about the different elements of the National Employment Standards, I highly recommend that you watch further in this series and learn more about the different elements. Thank you for listening today, and I'll hand you back over to Michelle.
Thank you, Kylie. Please remember, if you are a NatRoad member, you can call for advice and support regarding the award rates and the National Employment Standards. Even if you're across the information or you just want to double check that what you're doing is correct, you are welcome to call. Our number is 1-800-272-144, or you can email membership@natroad.com.au. Thank you to NTI for sponsoring this webinar.